In 1887, a scarred woman stepped off a dusty train in Cedar Falls, Montana, clutching a worn leather satchel and a letter that promised her a new life. What the townspeople saw was damaged goods, a mail-order bride they whispered wasn't worth the paper her contract was written on. What they didn't see was the strength forged in fire, or the battle-hardened rancher who would recognize her true value when no one else could. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered platform. As the 8:15 locomotive hissed to a stop in Cedar Falls, Margaret stepped down carefully, her gloved hands gripping the iron rail as her boots found solid ground for the first time in 3 days. The mountain air was thinner here than back in Ohio, carrying the scent of pine and something wilder, something that spoke of endless horizons and untamed possibilities. She pulled her dark blue traveling dress straight and adjusted the high, a collar that concealed the worst of the scarring along her neck. The other passengers hurried past her toward the station house, their chatter mixing with the conductor's calls and the rhythmic chuff of the cooling engine. Margaret stood perfectly still, taking in her first glimpse of what was supposed to become home. Cedar Falls wasn't much to look at, a single main street lined with false front buildings, their paint peeling from harsh winters and unforgiving summers. The mercantile, the saloon, the church with its modest steeple pointing toward the vast Montana sky. Beyond the town's edges, rolling grasslands stretched toward distant peaks that looked close enough to touch but would take days to reach on horseback. "You must be the bride from Ohio." The voice belonged to a woman in her 50s, dressed in practical brown wool with graying hair pinned severely back. Her eyes took in Margaret's appearance with the calculating assessment of someone appraising livestock. "I'm Mrs. Helena Worthington, president of the Cedar Falls Ladies Auxiliary. Mr. Thompson sent word you'd be arriving today." Margaret nodded and extended her hand. "Margaret Sinclair, it's a pleasure to meet you, ma'am." Mrs. Worthington's handshake was brief and cool. Her gaze lingered on the left side of Margaret's face, where the scars began just below her cheekbone and disappeared beneath the high collar of her dress. The fire that had claimed her family's boarding house 2 years ago had left its mark, in puckered pink flesh that would never fully fade. "Yes, well," Mrs. Worthington cleared her throat delicately. "Mr. Thompson is finishing some business at the bank. He asked me to escort you to the hotel where you can freshen up before meeting him properly this evening." The pause before freshen up carried enough weight to sink a riverboat. Margaret had heard that particular tone before, in the voices of potential employers back in Columbus who'd taken one look at her face and suddenly remembered the position had been filled. In the whispers of church ladies who thought their charity in speaking to her at all was kindness enough. They walked down Main Street together, Mrs. Worthington maintaining a careful distance as if scarring might be contagious. The few townspeople they passed offered polite nods to Mrs. Worthington, but let their eyes slide over Margaret as though she were invisible. She was used to that too. The Cedar Falls Hotel was a 2-story building with a wide front porch and flower boxes that had seen better days. The desk clerk, a thin man with nervous hands, kept glancing at Margaret's face while Mrs. Worthington arranged for her room. "Room 12, upstairs at the end of the hall," Mrs. Worthington announced, handing Margaret a brass key. "Mr. Thompson will call for you at 7 o'clock sharp. I trust you have something appropriate to wear for dinner." Margaret's fingers tightened around the key. "I believe so, yes." "Good. Well then." Mrs. Worthington smoothed her skirts and prepared to leave. "A word of advice, Miss Sinclair. Mr. Thompson is a respected man in this community. He owns the largest ranch in the county and employs half the men in town. He could have his pick of brides, so perhaps—" "Well, Perhaps it would be wise to remember that some matches require more gratitude than others. The words hit their mark, as intended. Margaret felt the familiar burn of shame rise in her chest, the same feeling that had driven her to answer a stranger's advertisement for a wife in the first place. Back in Ohio, she'd been the daughter of respectable innkeepers. Until the fire changed everything. Now she was damaged goods, seeking charity from a man who'd never seen her face. "I understand," she said quietly. Mrs. Worthington nodded with satisfaction and swept out of the hotel lobby, leaving Margaret alone with the desk clerk's pitying stares. Room 12 was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over the street. Margaret set her satchel on the bed and unpacked her few belongings with the methodical care of someone who'd learned to make a little go a long way. 3 dresses, some undergarments, her mother's Bible, and the packet of letters from Samuel Thompson that had brought her here. She pulled out the first letter, written in a careful hand on quality paper. Seeking a wife of good character and moral standing, age 25-35 preferred, must be willing to relocate to Montana Territory and assist with household duties. Previous marriage experience not required. Respond with photographs and references if interested. It had taken her 3 weeks to work up the courage to respond. Another 2 weeks to save enough money for a photograph at the local studio, where the photographer had positioned her carefully to minimize the scarring. Her letter had been honest. About the fire, but vague about the extent of her injuries. She told herself it wasn't really deception, just careful presentation. Samuel Thompson's subsequent letters had been kind, even warm. He'd written about his ranch, about the beauty of Montana, about his hopes for a quiet domestic life with the right woman. He'd never once asked directly about her scars, though she'd mentioned them briefly in her second letter. His response had been surprisingly gentle. "We all carry marks from life's trials, Miss Sinclair. What matters is the character beneath." Now, sitting in a strange hotel room, 1,000 miles from everything she'd ever known, Margaret wondered if he'd feel the same way when confronted with the reality of her appearance. She moved to the washstand and poured water from the pitcher into the basin. Her reflection in the small mirror showed the truth she couldn't hide forever. The left side of her face bore the unmistakable marks of fire, skin that had healed but would never look the same, pulling slightly at the corner of her eye and mouth. Her neck was worse, which was why she favored high collars and long sleeves even in summer heat, but her right side was unmarked, and her dark brown eyes held a strength that 2 years of rebuilding her life from nothing had earned. Her hair was still thick and lustrous, the deep auburn that had been her one vanity before the fire. She was 28 years old, educated, capable, and determined to make this marriage work, regardless of what Samuel Thompson looked like or how he might react to her scars. As afternoon wore into evening, Margaret prepared for the most important dinner of her life. She chose her best dress, a deep green wool that brought out her eyes and covered everything that needed covering. She pinned her hair in a simple but elegant style and applied just enough powder to even out her complexion without looking artificial. At precisely 7 o'clock, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside her door. Margaret took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and prepared to meet the man who held her future in his hands. The knock was firm, but not aggressive. Margaret opened the door to find a tall man in his early 30s, clean-shaven and wearing a well-tailored dark suit that couldn't quite disguise the breadth of shoulders more accustomed to ranch work than formal dinners. His brown hair was neatly combed, but showed signs of having been tousled by the wind. Most striking were his eyes, a deep blue that seemed to take in everything without judgment. "Miss Sinclair?" His voice was exactly as she'd imagined from his. Letters, deep, steady, with just a hint of the southern accent he'd mentioned growing up with in Texas. "I'm Samuel Thompson." She noticed he didn't flinch when he saw her face, didn't let his eyes linger on the scarring before meeting her gaze. Instead, he looked at her the way a man looks at a woman he's genuinely pleased to meet. "Mr. Thompson, it's a pleasure to finally meet you in person." He smiled, and she saw genuine warmth in it. "The pleasure is entirely mine. I hope the journey wasn't too difficult?" "Not at all. Montana is even more beautiful than your letters described. Wait until you see it in full daylight. But tonight, I thought we might have dinner and get acquainted properly. If that suits you." Margaret nodded, accepting the arm he offered. As they walked down the hotel stairs together, she caught sight of their reflection in the lobby mirror. They looked like what they were supposed to be, a respectable couple heading out for an evening together. She wondered how long that illusion would last once the rest of Cedar Falls got a good look at Samuel Thompson's scarred mail-order bride. The Cedar Falls restaurant occupied the ground floor of what had once been someone's grand home, complete, with crystal chandeliers that had seen better days and wallpaper that spoke of Eastern refinement transported west. Samuel guided Margaret to a corner table where the lamplight was soft and forgiving, pulling out her chair with the practiced courtesy of a man raised by a mother who'd insisted on proper manners regardless of geography. "The beef here is decent," he said, settling across from her. "Mrs. Patterson raises her own cattle, and her cook actually knows the difference between rare and leather." His eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he smiled, suggesting he laughed often despite the serious set of his jaw. Margaret found herself relaxing slightly. Whatever else Samuel Thompson might be, he wasn't the sort of man who made a woman feel like she needed to apologize for existing. "I haven't had proper beef in months. The boarding house where I worked served more beans than meat." "You worked in a boarding house after the fire?" She nodded, grateful he'd brought it up directly rather than dancing around it. "Mrs. Henley took pity on me when I had nowhere else to go. I helped with cooking and cleaning in exchange for room and board. It wasn't much, but it kept body and soul together while I figured out what came next." Samuel leaned back in his chair, studying her with those steady blue eyes. That must have taken considerable courage. Starting over from nothing rarely is. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'm not sure courage had much to do with it. Sometimes you just do what needs doing, because the alternative is giving up entirely. In my experience, that's exactly what courage is. The waiter approached, a young man with eager eyes who clearly recognized Samuel as someone worth impressing. "Evening, Mr. Thompson. Will you and the lady be having the usual?" "I think we'll try something different tonight, Billy. What does Mrs. Patterson recommend?" "She's got fresh trout from the river and beef steaks thick as your fist, green beans, from her own garden and potatoes done up with butter and herbs." Samuel looked to Margaret. "The trout is excellent if you're inclined toward fish." "That sounds perfect." As Billy hurried away to place their order, Samuel turned his attention back to Margaret. "Tell me about Ohio. Your letters mentioned you. Grew up there, but not much else about your family?" Margaret folded her hands in her lap, choosing her words carefully. "My parents ran the Sinclair House boarding establishment in Columbus. It catered to traveling businessmen and families passing through. Mother handled the kitchen and housekeeping while father managed the books and maintenance. They built it from nothing over 15 years. Built it and lost it in one night, from what you've told me. The fire started in the kitchen sometime after midnight. By the time the fire brigade arrived, the whole building was engulfed. My parents..." She paused, forcing herself to continue. "They didn't make it out. I was visiting my aunt across town that night, which is the only reason I'm here talking to you now." Samuel's expression grew serious. "I'm sorry for your loss. Losing family is never easy, especially that way." "Thank you. The hardest part wasn't just losing them, but losing everything they'd worked for. The boarding house, their reputation, the life they'd built. I tried to rebuild, but..." She gestured vaguely toward her scarred face. People have certain expectations about the appearance of women who serve the public. Their expectations say more about them than about you." Margaret looked up sharply, surprised by the firmness in his voice. "You're very kind to say so." "I'm not being kind. I'm being honest. Anyone who judges a person's worth by surface scars has never faced real adversity themselves." There was something in his tone that suggested personal experience, but before Margaret could ask, Billy returned. With their meals. The trout was perfectly prepared, flaky and seasoned with herbs Margaret couldn't identify. The conversation shifted to lighter topics. The weather, the growth of Cedar Falls, Samuel's ranch operations. "The Circle T has been in operation for 8 years now," he explained, cutting into his steak with precise movements. "Started with nothing but a homestead claim and more ambition than sense. Now we run about 1,500 head of cattle across 12,000 acres. That sounds like quite an accomplishment for 8 years. Hard work and good timing mostly. Got established just as the railroad pushed through, which meant we could get cattle to market without driving them all the way to Kansas. Made the difference between scraping by and actually prospering." Margaret detected pride in his voice, but not boastfulness. Samuel Thompson struck her as a man who'd earned what he had through sweat and determination rather than luck or inheritance. "Do you manage it all yourself?" "I have a foreman, Jake Morrison, who's been with me since the 2nd year. Good man knows cattle better than most people know their own families. We employ about 20 hands year-round, more during roundup and branding season. It's a substantial operation, but it takes all of us working together to keep it running." "And now you're looking for a wife to complete the picture." Samuel set down his fork and met her eyes directly. "I'm looking for a partner, Margaret. Someone to share the life I'm building, not just occupy space in my house." There's a difference. The way he said her name, without hesitation or the careful pronunciation people used when they were trying to be polite about something distasteful, sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "What made you decide to advertise for a wife, rather than court someone locally? Have you met the available women in Cedar Falls?" Samuel's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Mrs. Worthington has been trying to match me with every unmarried female between here and Billings for the past 3 years. Unfortunately, most of them are either barely out of the schoolroom or—" He paused diplomatically. "Or what?" "Let's just say that small towns tend to produce women with very specific ideas about what constitutes proper behavior for a rancher's wife. I need someone who can think for herself and isn't afraid of hard work or unconventional situations. And you thought a mail-order bride would be more likely to possess those qualities? I thought a woman willing to travel 1,000 miles to marry a stranger would have to be either very brave or very desperate. I was hoping for bravery." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "And if she turns out to be desperate instead?" Samuel's expression grew serious again. "Then I'd want to know why, and whether there was anything I could do to help her feel less so." The simple kindness in his words caught Margaret off guard. She'd braced herself for judgment, disappointment, or at best polite tolerance. She hadn't expected genuine consideration for her circumstances. "You're not what I expected," she admitted. "What did you expect?" "Someone harder, I suppose, more demanding. Most men who advertise for wives are looking for servants they don't have to pay wages." "Some are," Samuel agreed, "but I already have people who work for me. What I don't have is someone who chooses to be with me, who has a stake in what we're building together." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of dessert. Apple pie with thick cream that Billy assured them was Mrs. Patterson's specialty. As they ate, Samuel told her more about the ranch, about the challenges of weather and markets, about his plans to expand into horse breeding alongside cattle. "Montana's changing," he explained. "The days of open range are numbered. Homesteaders are filing claims, Fencing land, planting crops. Smart ranchers are adapting instead of fighting the inevitable. How are you adapting? Better breeding stock, for one thing. I've brought in Hereford bulls to improve our herd genetics. Diversifying into horses gives us another income stream, and they require less grazing land per head. And I'm buying up adjacent properties when they come available instead of relying on public land that might not stay available. Margaret found herself genuinely interested in his explanations. Samuel spoke about his work with the passion of someone who'd found his calling, but also with the practical wisdom of someone who understood that passion without planning led to failure. You make it sound like you're building an empire rather than just running a ranch. Maybe I am. This country rewards people who think big and work hard to make it happen. I'd like to build something that lasts, something worth passing on to the next generation. Children? Samuel's expression grew thoughtful. Eventually, if God wills it, and I find the right woman to share that dream with. The implication hung in the air between them. Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with hope she was afraid to trust. And if that woman comes with complications? Everyone comes with complications, Margaret. The question is whether they're the kind you can work through together or the kind that pushes you apart. She wanted to ask him directly about her scars, about whether he could truly accept a wife who would never be conventionally beautiful, who might face whispers and stares wherever they went together. But the restaurant was growing crowded with the evening's diners, and she wasn't ready for that conversation in public. As if reading her thoughts, Samuel signaled Billy for the check. "Would you like to take a walk? The evening's pleasant, and I'd like to show you a bit more of Cedar Falls before it gets too dark." Margaret nodded, accepting his offered arm as they left the restaurant. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossibly vivid after Ohio's gentler sunsets. The air carried the scent of sage and wildflowers, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled the hour. They walked slowly down Main Street, Samuel pointing out various businesses and explaining their significance to the community. The barbershop where Dr. Mills also pulled teeth and set bones. The general store was run by the Kowalski family, Polish immigrants who'd arrived 5 years ago with nothing but determination and had built the most successful mercantile in 3 counties. "Everyone here has a story," Samuel observed as they paused in front of the church. "Most of them involve leaving something behind to find something better. It's that kind of place." "What did you leave behind?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "Texas. Family land that had been in the Thompson name for 3 generations. My father expected me to stay and work the cotton plantation alongside my older brother. But you didn't want to." "I couldn't. After the war." He trailed off, and Margaret saw something shadow his expression. "Let's just say that some of us came home from fighting to find that the world we'd left didn't exist anymore. And maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing." Margaret heard layers in his words that she didn't fully understand, but she recognized the tone of someone who'd made difficult choices and lived with the consequences. "So you came west to start over. I came west to build something new instead of trying to resurrect something that was already dead. Best decision I ever made, even if it meant disappointing my family." They'd reached the end of Main Street, where the town gave way to open grassland that stretched toward the dark silhouettes of the mountains. The first stars were beginning to appear in the deepening sky, brighter than Margaret had ever seen them in Ohio. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It grows on you. The space, the freedom, the sense that anything's possible if you're willing to work for it." Samuel turned to face her fully. "Margaret, I want you to know that whatever you decide about staying, about us, I'll make sure you're taken care of. If this isn't what you want, I'll pay for your passage back to Ohio. And enough. Extra to help you get established again. The offer was generous, more than generous, but it also made Margaret's heart sink. You're having second thoughts. I'm trying to be fair. You came here based on letters and a photograph that probably didn't show you what you were really getting into. Marriage is permanent, and I don't want you to feel trapped into anything because you don't have other options. Margaret studied his face in the gathering twilight, looking for signs of disappointment or regret. Instead, she saw only honest concern for her welfare. It was more consideration than she'd received from most people since the fire, and it made her decision easier. I didn't come here looking for an escape, Samuel. I came looking for a new beginning. There's a difference. Is there? An escape means you're running from something. A new beginning means you're running towards something. She took a breath, steadying herself for what she needed to say next. I won't pretend the fire didn't change things for me. I won't pretend that answering your advertisement wasn't partly born of necessity, but I also won't pretend that I haven't spent the last 4 hours talking with a man I genuinely like and respect. Samuel's expression brightened slightly. You like me? Don't let it go to your head, Margaret said with a small smile. But yes, I do. You're nothing like what I expected when I got on that train in Columbus. Better or worse? Different. Better. Be different, I think. They began walking back toward the hotel, their steps slow and comfortable. The evening had gone better than Margaret had dared hope, but she knew the real test was still ahead. Samuel had been kind and attentive, but they'd been in public, with the soft lamplight and careful conversation of a formal dinner. Tomorrow, in the harsh light of day and the reality of daily life, would be when she learned whether his acceptance of her scars was genuine or merely polite courtesy. I'd like to show you the ranch tomorrow if you're amenable, Samuel said as they reached the hotel's front steps. It's about an hour's ride from town, and I think you should see what you'd be getting into before you make any final decisions. I'd like that very much. Good. I'll come by around 9 with a buggy. Wear something practical. Ranch life isn't kind to fancy dresses. Margaret nodded, then hesitated. Samuel, the people I've met so far in Cedar Falls, they seem to have certain opinions about mail-order brides in general and scarred ones in particular. People always have opinions. The question is whether you're going to let their opinions determine how you live your life. Easier said than done when you have to face them every day. Samuel's expression grew serious. Margaret, I won't lie to you. Some people in this town can be small-minded and cruel, but they're not the people whose opinions matter. The people worth knowing will judge you by your character, not your appearance. As for the rest, he shrugged, their good opinion isn't worth having anyway. It was exactly what Margaret needed to hear, even if she wasn't entirely sure she believed it yet. Thank you for dinner, and for being so understanding. Thank you for traveling 1,000 miles to have dinner with a stranger. That took considerable courage. Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest again at his words. Good night, Samuel. Good night, Margaret. Sleep well. She watched him walk down the street until the shadows swallowed his tall figure, then climbed the stairs to her room with a lighter heart than she'd carried in months. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time since leaving Ohio, she felt genuinely hopeful about what lay ahead. Margaret woke before dawn to the sound of unfamiliar birds calling outside her window. The mountain air carried a crispness that made her pull the thin hotel blanket closer around her shoulders as she padded to the washstand. Through the glass, she could see the town beginning to stir, smoke rising from chimneys, a dog trotting purposefully down the empty street. The first golden light touching the peaks that surrounded Cedar Falls like protective sentinels. She chose her most practical dress, a sturdy brown cotton with long sleeves and a modest neckline that would serve her well for a day at the ranch. Her reflection showed dark circles under her eyes, from a restless night, spent wondering what Samuel's home would reveal about the man himself, and whether she was ready for whatever truths daylight might bring. At precisely 9 o'clock, The sound of wheels and hooves echoed outside the hotel. Margaret gathered her shawl and reticule, checking once more that her hair covered the worst of the scarring along her neck, then made her way downstairs to find Samuel waiting beside a well-maintained buggy hitched to a pair of matched bay horses. "Good morning," he called, tipping his hat. In daylight, dressed in work clothes rather than his dinner suit, he looked more at home, leather vest over a blue cotton shirt, dark trousers tucked into boots that had seen honest labor, a hat that shaded eyes already squinting against the bright morning sun. "Good morning, your horses are beautiful. Belle and Duchess, sisters from the same mare, trained together since they were colts. They know the way to the ranch better than I do." He helped her up onto the buggy seat with steady hands, then climbed up beside her and gathered the reins. "Ready to see what you might be getting yourself into?" Margaret nodded, settling her skirts as Samuel clicked to the horses. They moved through Cedar Falls at an easy trot, past the businesses just opening for the day and houses where women were already hanging, wash-on lines strung between cottonwood trees. Several people stopped their morning activities to watch them pass, the scarred mail-order bride and the eligible bachelor who could have had his pick of local women. "Let them look," Samuel said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "They'll find something else to occupy their attention soon enough." Once they left the town behind, the road became a dirt track, winding through grassland dotted with wildflowers Margaret couldn't name. The mountains seemed to grow larger with every mile, their snow-capped peaks stark against the brilliant blue sky. She found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the buggy wheels and the gentle conversation Samuel maintained about the landmarks they passed. "That creek runs year-round, fed by snowmelt from the high country. Good water, which is worth more than gold out here. The stand of cottonwoods marks where the old stage road used to run before they built the railroad. See that rocky outcrop? We call it Eagle's Perch. There's usually a pair nesting there come spring." His knowledge of the land was intimate and detailed, the familiarity of someone who'd walked every acre and knew every seasonal change. Margaret found herself genuinely interested in his explanations, drawn into his obvious love for this harsh, beautiful country. "How much of what we're seeing is yours? Everything from that ridgeline to the north, down to the creek, and east to those hills on the horizon. About 12,000 acres, like I mentioned last night, but it's the water rights that make it valuable. Land without water is just empty space." The ranch buildings appeared gradually, first as distant specks against the vastness, then resolving into a cluster of structures that spoke of careful planning and steady growth. The main house was larger than Margaret had expected, 2 stories of solid log construction with a wide wraparound porch and windows that would let in plenty of light. Outbuildings included a substantial barn, corrals, bunkhouses, and various sheds and storage buildings arranged with the practical efficiency of a working operation. "It's not fancy," Samuel said as they approached, "but it's well built and comfortable. I've been adding on as the ranch grew and I could afford improvements." Margaret studied the homestead with growing appreciation. This wasn't the rough cabin, as she'd half expected, but a genuine home, built by someone who planned to stay and prosper. Flower boxes under the porch windows showed a woman's touch, though Samuel had mentioned no female relatives. "The flowers are lovely. Who tends them?" "Mrs. Chen, my housekeeper. She insisted the place needed proper civilizing, as she puts it. Turns out she has strong opinions about what constitutes a respectable home." Samuel's tone held obvious affection for the woman. "She came west with her husband to work on the railroad. When the line was finished, they stayed on. He works as my blacksmith and general fix-it man, while she keeps the house running and cooks better meals than I deserve." As if summoned by his words, a small woman emerged from the house, wiping her hands on a practical apron. Margaret judged her to be in her 40s, with greying black hair pinned back severely and dark eyes that missed nothing. She moved with the efficient energy of someone accustomed to managing a household that served as headquarters for a substantial business operation. "Mrs. Chen, I'd like you to meet Miss Margaret Sinclair," Samuel said, as he helped Margaret down from the buggy. "Margaret, this is Mrs. Chen, who keeps me fed and the house respectable." Mrs. Chen's bow was slight but respectful. When she straightened, her gaze took in Margaret's appearance with the same thorough assessment Mrs. Worthington had given her, but without the barely concealed disapproval. Instead, Margaret detected something that might have been approved in the older woman's expression. "Miss Sinclair, welcome to Circle T Ranch. Mr. Thompson has spoken of your arrival with considerable anticipation." "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. Your home is beautiful." "It is good home for the right woman," Mrs. Chen replied with characteristic directness. "Wrong women make it a miserable place for everyone. Right woman makes it a place of happiness and prosperity." Margaret felt herself being evaluated and found the scrutiny less uncomfortable than she'd expected. Mrs. Chen struck her as someone who'd survived hardship through practical wisdom rather than wishful thinking, and whose good opinion would be worth earning. "Would you like some coffee before we tour the grounds?" Samuel asked. "Mrs. Chen makes the best coffee between here and Denver." That would be lovely. The interior of the house exceeded Margaret's expectations even more than the exterior had. The main room was spacious and comfortable, with furniture that was well made rather than expensive, and a stone fireplace large enough to heat the entire space. Windows on 3 sides let in abundant light, and the overall effect was of a home rather than a bachelor's temporary quarters. Mrs. Chen served coffee from a service that had clearly been chosen for durability over elegance, along with biscuits that were still warm from the oven. As they sat around the large wooden table that dominated one end of the room, Margaret found herself relaxing into genuine conversation about the challenges and rewards of ranch life. "The isolation is the hardest part for most people," Samuel explained. "Especially women used to town life. The nearest neighbor is 8 miles away, and in winter we might not see anyone outside the ranch for weeks at a time." "I'm accustomed to my own company," Margaret replied, "and after managing a boarding house, I suspect ranch life might actually feel peaceful by comparison." Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. "Boarding houses teach good skills for the ranch, always. Something need doing, always people need feeding, always problems need solving quick and efficiently." "What about medical emergencies?" Margaret asked. "How far is the nearest doctor?" "Doc Mills is in town, but he's getting old and doesn't like to make house calls unless it's truly serious. Most ranchers' wives learn to handle basic medical care themselves. Mrs. Morrison, Jake's wife, is particularly skilled with herbal remedies and has helped with several difficult births in the area." Margaret filed that information away, already thinking about the medical knowledge she'd need to acquire. The conversation continued over second cups of coffee, covering practical matters like supply runs to town, the seasonal rhythms of ranch work, and the social obligations that came with being a prominent rancher's wife. "There are certain expectations," Samuel said carefully. "Hosting dinner parties for business associates, participating in community events, contributing to charitable causes. Nothing too demanding, but you'd need to be comfortable representing the ranch in social situations." Margaret thought about Mrs. Worthington's assessment and the stares she'd already received in town. "And if some people have difficulty accepting a scarred woman in that role," Mrs. Chen made a dismissive sound. "People who judge by scars are people whose opinions are not worth having. Strong women make strong ranch. Pretty face is not helpful. When a baby is coming in a blizzard or cattle getting sick." Samuel smiled at his housekeeper's characteristic bluntness. "Mrs. Chen has strong opinions about what constitutes important qualifications in a rancher's wife. Mrs. Chen has lived long enough to know the difference between surface beauty and real worth," the older woman replied firmly. "Man who chooses a wife for a pretty face deserves what he gets when a pretty face grows old and ugly, but the woman beneath is still foolish and weak." The unexpected support from Samuel's housekeeper warmed Margaret more than she cared to admit. She was beginning to understand that the Circle T Ranch existed as its own small community, with its own values and loyalties that might matter more than the opinions of Cedar Falls society. After finishing their coffee, Samuel began the promised tour of the ranch facilities. They started with the barn, a massive structure that housed not only horses but also feed storage, equipment, and workshop space. Margaret was impressed by the organization and cleanliness. Everything had its place and was maintained in good repair. We keep about 30 horses year-round, Samuel explained as they walked past stalls occupied by various animals. Work horses for ranch operations, saddle horses for the hands, and breeding stock for the horse operation I'm developing. One stall held a magnificent stallion, black with white markings, who nickered softly as they approached. Samuel produced an apple from his pocket and offered it to the horse, who accepted it with gentle lips. "This is Thunder. Came from Kentucky bloodlines, cost me more than my first year's profit, but he's already proving his worth. The colts he's sired are exceptional." Margaret watched Samuel interact with the horse and saw genuine affection in his handling. A man who was gentle with animals would likely be gentle with people, she reasoned, storing away another positive observation about her potential husband. They continued to the corrals where several ranch hands were working with cattle, separating animals, for various purposes, with the practiced efficiency of men who knew their business. Samuel introduced her to Jake Morrison, his foreman, a weathered man in his 50s whose handshake was firm and whose eyes held the steady competence of someone accustomed to responsibility. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Sinclair," Jake said, touching his hat brim respectfully. "Sam's told us good things about you." "Thank you, Mr. Morrison. This is quite an impressive operation you're running here." Jake's weathered face creased into a smile. "We do our best. Takes good people working together to make it work, but we've got that in spades." As they walked among the various work areas, Margaret began to understand the scope of what Samuel had built. This wasn't just a ranch, but a complex business enterprise that provided employment for dozens of people and contributed significantly to the regional economy. The responsibility that came with being the wife of such an operation was beginning to dawn on her. "It's overwhelming at first," Samuel said, apparently reading her expression. "But you don't have to learn everything immediately. Mrs. Chen can teach you the household management aspects, and you'd gradually take on more responsibility as you became comfortable with it." What if I'm not suited for it? What if I can't live up to what's expected? Samuel stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "Margaret, I've spent the last 2 hours watching you ask intelligent questions, show genuine interest in what we're doing here, and treat my employees with respect and courtesy. Those are the qualities that matter for success in this life. Everything else can be learned." His confidence in her was both reassuring and daunting. Margaret had spent so much of the past 2 years focused on simple survival that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone believe in her potential for something greater. They concluded the tour at the ranch house porch, where Mrs. Chen had prepared a substantial lunch featuring beef that had obviously come from Circle T cattle. As they ate, Samuel shared more details about his plans for expanding the operation and his vision for the ranch's future. "The key is diversification," he explained. "Cattle will always be our primary business, but horses, selective farming, maybe even some mineral exploration if the opportunity arises. The more income streams we develop, the more stable we'll be when market conditions change." Margaret found herself drawn into the conversation, asking questions about logistics and markets that seemed to please Samuel with their practical focus. She was beginning to see herself as part of this enterprise, contributing to its success rather than simply occupying space in Samuel's house. "I should probably get you back to town before it gets too late," Samuel said, as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen. "But first, there's one more thing I'd like to show you." He led her to a small cemetery located on a hill overlooking the ranch buildings. It contained only a few graves, marked with simple wooden crosses bearing carved names and dates. Samuel stopped before one marked David Thompson, beloved brother, 1845-1876. "My younger brother," he said quietly. "He came west with me when we left Texas. Always was better with horses than I was, had plans to build the finest breeding. Operation in Montana Territory." Margaret saw the pain in Samuel's expression and understood instinctively that this loss had shaped him in fundamental ways. "What happened?" "Accident during a river crossing. His horse slipped on wet rocks, threw him into the current. By the time we got him out," Samuel's voice trailed off, "he lived long enough to make me promise I'd build something here worthy of both our dreams." The simple memorial spoke of love and loss that ran deeper than words could express. Margaret reached out instinctively and placed her hand gently on Samuel's arm, offering what comfort she could. "He would be proud of what you've accomplished," she said softly. "I hope so. David always said the best way to honor the dead was to live fully for the living. That's part of why I decided it was time to find a wife, to build a family, to create something that would outlast my own time here." The vulnerability in his admission touched something deep in Margaret's heart. This wasn't just about finding a convenient arrangement or even companionship. Samuel was offering her the chance to be part of something larger and more meaningful than either of them could build alone. As they drove back toward Cedar Falls, in the gathering twilight, Margaret felt the last of her reservations dissolving. The Circle T Ranch wasn't just Samuel's home. It was his legacy, his tribute to dreams shared with a beloved brother, his promise to the future. Being invited to share in that legacy was an honor she hadn't expected and wasn't sure she deserved. "Thank you for today," she said as the lights of town came into view. "For showing me your home, for trusting me with your story about David." "Thank you for listening," Samuel replied, "and for seeing possibilities instead of just problems." Margaret smiled in the darkness, feeling more hopeful about her future than she had since before the fire changed everything. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she was content to believe that sometimes scarred people were exactly what beautiful dreams needed to become reality. The morning of Margaret's third day in Cedar Falls dawned grey and blustery, with clouds gathering over the mountains like smoke from some distant fire. She'd spent a restless night wrestling with the decision that Samuel had given her time to make, her mind cycling between hope and fear in endless loops that left her exhausted despite the early hour. A sharp knock at her hotel room door interrupted her brooding. She opened it to find a young woman about her own age, dressed in the practical clothing of someone who worked for a living, but carried herself with quiet dignity that spoke of inner strength. "Miss Sinclair, I'm Emma Morrison, Jake's wife. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I was hoping we might have a chance to talk." Margaret recognized the name from yesterday's ranch visit and stepped aside to invite her in. Emma Morrison was a small woman with auburn hair and intelligent green eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine, and something in her manner immediately put Margaret at ease. "Mrs. Morrison, please come in. Can I offer you some water? I'm afraid I don't have much else to offer. Just Emma, please." "And no, thank you. I won't keep you long, but I wanted to speak with you before—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Before you make your final decision about Samuel and the ranch." Margaret gestured for Emma to take the room's single chair while she perched on the edge of the bed. "I hope Mr. Thompson didn't send you to speak on his behalf. That would be rather presumptuous." Emma laughed, a sound that held genuine warmth. "Oh, Samuel has no idea I'm here. In fact, he'd probably be mortified if he knew I was interfering. But Jake and I have been at the Circle T for 6 years now, and we've watched Samuel build that place from almost nothing. He's become like family to us. And you're concerned about his choice of wife. I'm concerned about whether you understand what you'd be taking on," Emma said frankly. "Not the ranch work. That can be learned. But being Samuel Thompson's wife in this community, well, let's just say it comes with unique challenges." Margaret felt her defenses rise. "Because of my scars." "Partly because of your scars, yes, but more because of what they represent to certain people in Cedar Falls." Emma leaned forward, her expression serious. "Margaret, may I call you Margaret? There are people in this town who've spent years trying to marry their daughters or sisters or nieces to Samuel Thompson. He's the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties, with more money and influence than most men see in a lifetime. And now he's chosen to marry a damaged mail-order bride instead of one of their pristine local beauties." "Exactly. You're not just dealing with prejudice about your appearance. You're dealing with wounded pride, financial disappointment, and social embarrassment for families who had their futures planned around a Thompson marriage." Margaret absorbed this information with growing unease. She'd expected some social difficulties, but the scope of what Emma was describing sounded more like entering enemy territory than joining a community. "Are you trying to discourage me from marrying him?" Emma was quiet for a moment, studying Margaret's face with those perceptive green eyes. "I'm trying to make sure you know what you're walking into so you can make an informed decision. Samuel is a good man, the best I've ever known outside of my own husband, but he has blind spots when it comes to how cruel people can be. He thinks because he accepts you, everyone else should too. And you don't think they will? Some will eventually. Others never will, no matter what you do or how well you fulfill your role as his wife. The question is whether you're strong enough to build a life despite their opposition, and whether you care enough about Samuel to make that fight worthwhile." Margaret rose and moved to the window, looking out at the grey morning and the mountains beyond. "You think I should refuse him? I think you should be honest with yourself about why you're here and what you want from this marriage." Emma's voice was gentle but direct. "If you're looking for safety and security after losing everything, Samuel can certainly provide that. But if that's all this is to you, you'll both end up miserable eventually. And if it's more than that, then you have a chance at something remarkable. Samuel Thompson is the kind of man who loves completely, who builds dreams big enough for 2 people to share, but he needs a partner who can match his strength, not someone who needs him to carry her through life." Margaret turned back to face Emma, recognizing the challenge implicit in her words. "You're testing me." "I suppose I am. Jake and I love that ranch, and we've invested 6 years of our lives helping Samuel build it. We don't want to see it torn apart by a marriage that's wrong for both parties. What would convince you that I'm right for it?" Emma smiled, and Margaret saw approval in her expression for the first time. "The fact that you asked that question instead of getting defensive tells me you might be." They were interrupted by another knock at the door, more hesitant than Emma's had been. Margaret opened it to find a girl who couldn't be more than 16, with blonde curls and blue eyes reddened from recent tears. "Miss Sinclair, I'm Rebecca Worthington. I was hoping I could speak with you for a moment." Margaret recognized the surname and saw the family resemblance to the stern woman who'd met her at the train station. This must be Mrs. Worthington's daughter, though she bore little resemblance to her mother in temperament. "Of course, Miss Worthington, please come in. This is Mrs. Morrison." Rebecca nodded politely to Emma, but seemed nervous about stating her business in front of a witness. Emma, reading the situation correctly, rose to leave. "I should be getting back anyway." "Margaret, thank you for the conversation. I hope we'll have many more in the future." After Emma left, Rebecca remained standing near the door, twisting her hands anxiously. Margaret waited patiently, recognizing the signs of someone working up courage to say something difficult. "My mother doesn't know I'm here," Rebecca finally blurted out. "She'd be furious if she found out I was talking to you." "Why are you here then?" Rebecca's composure cracked and tears began flowing down her cheeks. "Because it's not fair what they're saying about you. Because you seem kind and decent and you don't deserve the treatment you're getting from people who don't even know you." Margaret handed the girl a handkerchief and guided her to the chair Emma had vacated. "What are people saying?" "Terrible things. That you're desperate and pathetic, that Mr. Thompson is making a mistake that will ruin his reputation, that you're probably lying about your background and maybe even your scars aren't real." Rebecca's voice dropped to a whisper. "Mother said you're exactly the sort of woman who gives mail-order brides a bad name." The words stung, but Margaret had expected worse. "And what do you think?" "I think you're brave. I think leaving everything you knew to start over somewhere new takes more courage than most of us ever have to find." Rebecca looked up with eyes that held wisdom beyond her years. "And I think Mr. Thompson is lucky to have found someone who sees past surface appearances to what really matters." Margaret was touched by the girl's sincerity. "That's very kind of you to say." "It's not kindness, it's the truth. Do you know why I really came here?" Rebecca wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders with visible effort. "Because 3 years ago, when I was 13, I fell from my horse and broke my leg badly. It healed, crooked, and now I walk with a limp, not terrible, but noticeable enough that people stare sometimes." Margaret looked more carefully and saw what she'd missed before. The slight unevenness in Rebecca's stance, the way she favored her left leg. "Mother pretends it doesn't exist, tells people it's barely noticeable, acts like it's something shameful that we need to hide. But you wear your scars like they're just part of who you are. You don't hide or apologize or act ashamed. I wanted to meet someone who could teach me how to do that." The unexpected admission left Margaret momentarily speechless. She'd been so focused on her own insecurities that she hadn't considered how her example might affect others struggling with similar challenges. "Rebecca, I don't think I'm as confident as you imagine. Most days, I still struggle with feeling self-conscious about my appearance. But you got on a train and traveled 1,000 miles to start a new life. You had dinner with Mr. Thompson in public where everyone could see you. You visited his ranch and met his employees. That's not the behavior of someone who's ashamed of herself." Rebecca's perspective forced Margaret to reconsider her own actions over the past few days. Perhaps she had been braver than she'd given herself credit for. "Your mother probably has good intentions," Margaret said carefully. "She wants to protect you from unkind comments, I know. But pretending I'm not different doesn't make me normal. It just makes me feel like being different is something terrible." Rebecca stood, her composure restored. "I should go before Mother realizes where I am. But I wanted you to know that not everyone in Cedar Falls judges people by their scars. Some of us judge them by their courage." After Rebecca left, Margaret sat alone in her room, thinking about the morning's unexpected visitors. Emma Morrison had challenged her to examine her motives and commitment. Rebecca Worthington had shown her that her choices affected more than just herself and Samuel. Both conversations had forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about what lay ahead. The sound of horses in the street drew her to the window, where she saw Samuel dismounting in front of the hotel. He moved with the easy grace of someone equally comfortable in a saddle or a drawing room, and Margaret felt the familiar flutter of attraction mixed with apprehension that his presence seemed to trigger. His knock was distinctive now, firm but patient, like the man himself. Margaret opened the door to find him holding a bouquet of wildflowers that must have come from the meadows around his ranch. "Good morning. I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I wanted to bring you these before they wilted completely," he offered. The flowers with a slight smile. They're not much compared to what a fancy florist might provide, but they're honest flowers from Montana soil. Margaret accepted the bouquet, touched by the simple gesture. "They're beautiful, Samuel, thank you. I was wondering if you might join me for a ride this morning. There's something I'd like to show you, and it seems like a good day for making decisions." Margaret heard layers of meaning in his words and realized he was giving her an opportunity to have the conversation they'd been dancing around since her arrival. "Let me get my shawl." They rode out of town in Samuel's buggy, but this time he turned north instead of toward the ranch, following a track that wound through stands of aspen, whose leaves were just beginning to show the first hints of autumn gold. The morning's clouds had begun to break up, allowing shafts of sunlight to illuminate the rolling landscape in patches of brilliant green and shadow. "Where are we going?" Margaret asked. "To see the future," Samuel replied cryptically. "Or at least my vision of it." They crested a ridge and found themselves looking down into a broad valley watered by a meandering creek. The land was rich and green, dotted with wildflowers and bordered by timber-covered hills that promised both beauty and resources. It was empty of human habitation, but clearly suitable for development. Samuel pulled the buggy to a stop and helped Margaret down so they could walk to the edge of the ridge for a better view. "Well, what do you see?" he asked. Margaret studied the valley carefully, trying to understand what he was showing her. Beautiful land, good water, fertile soil, natural shelter from the worst weather. It would be perfect for a town, Samuel finished. "The railroad is planning a spur line through this valley within the next 5 years. When that happens, this whole area will change. There'll be new settlements, new businesses, new opportunities for people willing to invest early and build smart." The scope of his vision was breathtaking. Margaret could see it now. Neat streets laid out along the creek, businesses serving the railroad and surrounding ranches, homes for the families that would follow the economic opportunities. "You're planning to develop it yourself?" "In partnership with others, yes. I've been quietly buying land options throughout the valley, and I have investors interested in backing the development when the time comes." Samuel's eyes held the same passion she'd seen when he talked about the ranch. "This could be bigger than anything Montana Territory has seen outside of Helena or Billings. And you want a wife who can be part of something that ambitious." Samuel turned to face her directly. "I want a wife who can dream as big as I do and isn't afraid of the work it takes to make dreams real. Margaret, I'm not offering you a quiet domestic life on a small ranch. I'm offering you the chance to help build something that will shape this whole region for generations." The magnitude of what he was proposing was both exhilarating and terrifying. Margaret had spent so much energy simply surviving the past 2 years that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to think about building rather than just enduring. "What if I'm not equal to it? What if I disappoint you?" Samuel stepped closer, his expression earnest. "What if you exceed every expectation I have? What if together we accomplish things that neither of us could manage alone?" Margaret looked out over the valley again, trying to imagine herself as part of Samuel's grand plans, the scared, scarred woman who'd stepped off the train 3 days ago seemed like a different person already. Perhaps she was capable of more than she'd believed. "The people in Cedar Falls who disapprove of me, they'll be even more opposed to seeing me in a position of influence and prosperity. Let them be opposed. Success is the best response to small-minded criticism." Samuel's voice carried quiet conviction. "Margaret, I need you to understand something. I'm not asking you to marry me despite your scars. I'm asking you to marry me because of who you are, the woman who survived devastating loss and built a new life from nothing. The woman who had the courage to travel across the country to meet a stranger, The woman who asks intelligent questions and treats my employees with respect and sees possibilities instead of just problems. His words echoed what Emma Morrison had said about needing a partner who could match his strength rather than someone who needed to be carried. Margaret realized she'd been thinking about this marriage all wrong, not as Samuel offering her rescue, but as him offering her partnership in something extraordinary. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "when would you want to have the ceremony?" Samuel's face lit up with hope. "As soon as you're ready. Tomorrow, if you're willing. I've already spoken with Reverend Matthews about performing the service." The speed took Margaret's breath away, but she realized there was no practical reason to delay. Her decision was made, and waiting wouldn't change the challenges they'd face together. "Tomorrow," she agreed, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Samuel's smile was radiant. "Tomorrow," he repeated, and Margaret felt the future shift around them like settling earth, solid and full of promise, despite the storms that might still come. Margaret stood before the small mirror in her hotel room, her hands trembling slightly, as she fastened the pearl buttons on her only good dress, a deep burgundy silk that had belonged to her mother. The morning light streaming through the window was unforgivingly bright, highlighting every line of scarring along her neck and jaw. But for once, she didn't immediately turn away from her reflection. Today, she would become Mrs. Samuel Thompson. Realization still felt surreal, as if she were watching someone else's life unfold, rather than living her own. 3 days ago, she'd been a woman with no prospects beyond scraping together enough money to survive another month. Now she was preparing to marry one of the most successful men in Montana Territory and step into a role that would make her one of the most prominent women in the region. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find Emma Morrison holding a small bouquet of white roses and baby's breath, her face glowing with genuine warmth. "I thought you might like these for your wedding," Emma said, offering the flowers. "Jake cut them from Mrs. Patterson's garden this morning, with her permission, of course." Margaret accepted the bouquet gratefully, touched by the kindness. "Emma, you didn't have to do this. Every bride deserves flowers on her wedding day. Besides, I wanted to apologize for yesterday's conversation. I hope I didn't seem presumptuous. Questioning your motives. You were protecting someone you care about. I respect that." Margaret stepped aside to let Emma enter. "Actually, I'm grateful you were honest with me. It helped me understand what I was really choosing." Emma's smile was relieved. "And you're certain about your choice? More certain than I've been about anything since the fire." Margaret moved to the washstand, using the mirror to pin the flowers in her hair. "I won't pretend I'm not nervous about what lies ahead, but I'm done letting fear make my decisions for me." "Good. Fear is a terrible compass for navigation through life." Emma watched Margaret arrange the flowers with an expert eye. "You look beautiful, by the way. Samuel is going to forget how to speak when he sees you." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd been so focused on the practical aspects of marriage, the social challenges, the business responsibilities, the domestic arrangements, that she'd barely considered the intimate reality of becoming Samuel's wife in every sense. The thought sent a flutter of nervousness through her chest that had nothing to do with public opinion or social acceptance. "Emma, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. How did you know Jake was the right choice? How did you know you could build a life together despite whatever obstacles you might face?" Emma was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "We met during a terrible blizzard my first winter in Montana. I was teaching school in a town that doesn't exist anymore, and I got caught in the storm trying to reach a sick student's family. Jake found me half frozen and barely alive, carried me to safety, and nursed me back to health for 3 weeks while the snow kept us trapped in his cabin." Margaret waited, sensing there was more to the story. By the time the storm cleared, we knew everything about each other that mattered. Not the polite social conversation you have during courtship, but the real things. How we handled fear and hardship, whether we could depend on each other when things got desperate, whether we brought out the best or worst in each other under pressure. And you brought out the best in each other? We did. Jake saw me at my weakest and most vulnerable, and instead of losing respect for me, he became more protective and caring. I saw him shoulder responsibility for my welfare without complaint or expectation of reward, and I knew he was the kind of man who would stand by his commitments no matter what came. Margaret considered this wisdom while Emma helped her with the final adjustments to her dress and hair. The story resonated because it described exactly what she'd been trying to understand about her own situation. Whether she and Samuel would strengthen each other or become burdens to one another when tested by adversity. You think Samuel and I have that potential? I think you've already started proving it. You've seen him handle the pressure of building a business empire, and he's seen you rebuild your life from tragedy. You've both chosen each other knowing the challenges you'll face together. That's a stronger foundation than most marriages begin with. Another knock at the door interrupted their conversation. This time, it was Rebecca Worthington, looking nervous but determined, carrying a small, wrapped package. Miss Sinclair, I mean Mrs. Thompson, I brought you something. Well, my grandmother did, actually. She wanted me to give it to you before the ceremony. Margaret unwrapped the package to reveal a delicate lace handkerchief, obviously old and carefully preserved. The initial M was embroidered in one corner with thread that had faded to a soft gold. It was my grandmother's wedding handkerchief, Rebecca explained. She said every bride should have something old, and the M works for Margaret just as well as it did for her name, which was Miriam. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected kindness. Rebecca, this is too precious. I couldn't possibly. Grandmother insists. She said. Rebecca glanced at Emma, then back to Margaret. She said that women who face life's hardships with dignity deserve to be supported by other women who understand what strength really means. The implication was clear. Rebecca's grandmother had recognized something in Margaret that transcended surface appearance or social convention. Margaret carefully tucked the handkerchief into her sleeve where tradition dictated it should remain throughout the ceremony. Please thank your grandmother for me. This means more than I can express. Emma glanced at the clock on the washstand. We should be getting to the church. Samuel will be waiting, and Reverend Matthews doesn't like to keep ceremonies waiting. When he has afternoon appointments. The three women made their way downstairs and outside, where Jake Morrison waited with a decorated buggy to transport the bride to her wedding. The flowers and ribbons adorning the vehicle were clearly Emma's work, transforming a practical ranch conveyance into something suitable for the occasion. You look radiant, Mrs. Thompson, Jake said as he helped Margaret into the buggy. Samuel's a lucky man. I think we're both fortunate, Margaret replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. The short ride to the church passed in a blur of nervous anticipation mixed with growing excitement. Margaret found herself looking at Cedar Falls with new eyes, seeing it not as a place where she was temporarily visiting, but as her new home. The businesses along Main Street would become familiar daily sights. The people she passed would become neighbors and acquaintances whose opinions would shape her social existence. Some of those people had gathered outside the church, drawn by curiosity about Samuel Thompson's wedding to the scarred mail-order bride. Margaret felt their stares, but kept her chin high, remembering Emma's words about fear making poor navigation. She was done hiding from public scrutiny. The church was small but well-maintained, with wooden pews that could accommodate perhaps 50 people and windows that cast colored light across the simple altar. Margaret was surprised to see that nearly every seat was occupied. Apparently, Samuel Thompson's wedding was considered a significant social event, regardless of the controversial nature of his bride choice. Mrs. Chen sat in the front pew, dressed in her finest clothes and wearing an expression of dignified approval. Several men Margaret recognized from the ranch occupied the seats behind her, their presence a show of support for their employers' happiness. She also spotted Dr. Mills, the elderly physician, and Mr. Kowalski from the general store, along with various other townspeople whose motivations for attendance ranged from genuine goodwill to undisguised curiosity. But it was Samuel who commanded her attention as she walked down the aisle on Jake Morrison's steadying arm. He stood at the altar in a dark suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and steady bearing, his blue eyes fixed on her face with an expression of wonder and joy that made her forget anyone else existed in the room. Reverend Matthews was a thin man with kind eyes and a voice that carried easily through the small space. His words about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of commitment seemed to take on special significance, given the circumstances that had brought bride and groom together. Marriage is not merely a social arrangement or business partnership, he intoned, but a sacred covenant between two souls who choose to face life's joys and sorrows as one united force. It requires courage, faith, and the willingness to see beyond surface appearances to the eternal worth of another human being. Margaret felt the weight of those words settle around her like a blessing. When it came time for vows, Samuel's voice was steady and sure as he promised to love, honor, and cherish her for all the days of his life. Her own voice surprised her with its strength as she made the same commitment, knowing she meant every word despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The moment when Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife felt both momentous and natural, as if the ceremony was simply making official what had already been decided by forces larger than their individual choices. Samuel's kiss was gentle but sure, a promise of intimacy to come that sent warmth spreading through Margaret's entire body. The recessional down the aisle was a blur of congratulations and well wishes from people whose sincerity varied considerably. Mrs. Worthington offered stiff felicitations that couldn't quite hide her disapproval, while Dr. Mills pressed Margaret's hand warmly and told her she was exactly what the community needed in a prominent citizen's wife. Outside the church, rice showered down from the hands of well-wishers as Samuel helped Margaret into the decorated buggy that would carry them to their new life together. The Circle T Ranch had never looked more welcoming than it did as they approached in the golden light of late afternoon, its buildings solid and prosperous against the backdrop of the Montana mountains. Mrs. Chen had outdone herself preparing for their arrival. The house was filled with the scent of her finest cooking, and she'd arranged flowers in every room with an artistry that transformed the practical ranch headquarters into something approaching elegance. A wedding supper had been laid out in the main room, complete with a small cake decorated with sugar flowers that must have taken hours to create. "Welcome home, Mrs. Thompson," Mrs. Chen said with unusual formality, but her smile was genuine and warm. Home. The word resonated through Margaret's consciousness as she looked around the room that was now officially hers to manage and care for. This was no longer Samuel's house that she was visiting. It was their house, their life, their shared future taking tangible form. The wedding supper was attended by the ranch hands and their families, creating a celebration that felt more like a community gathering than a formal reception. Margaret found herself relaxing into genuine conversation with people who would now be part of her daily life, learning names and relationships and beginning to understand the complex social dynamics of the Circle T operation. Jake Morrison offered a toast that was both heartfelt and diplomatic. To Samuel and Margaret Thompson, may their partnership bring prosperity to the ranch and happiness to all who depend on their success. As evening settled over the ranch and the celebration wound down, Margaret felt a mixture of exhaustion and nervous anticipation. The public aspects of the wedding were complete, but the private reality of marriage was just beginning. She and Samuel were now legally bound together, but they were still essentially strangers who had chosen to build intimacy and trust through shared experience rather than courtship. Samuel seemed to sense her nervousness as they stood together, on the porch, watching their wedding guests depart into the gathering darkness. "We don't have to rush anything," he said quietly. "This is a big adjustment for both of us." Margaret appreciated his consideration, but she also recognized that avoiding the reality of their marriage wouldn't make the transition any easier. "I'm nervous," she admitted, "but not unwilling. We're married now, Samuel. We might as well begin as we mean to continue." His smile was warm and relieved. "Then let's go inside, Mrs. Thompson, and start figuring out how to be married to each other." As they walked through the door of their home together, Margaret felt the last of her old life fall away like a discarded garment. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was no longer the desperate woman who'd answered a stranger's advertisement for a wife. She was Margaret Thompson, partner in an enterprise that would shape the future of Montana Territory, and she was ready to discover what kind of woman that responsibility would require her to become. The bedroom that Samuel showed her had been prepared with obvious care, fresh linens, flowers on the washstand, and a new nightgown laid out on the bed that spoke of Mrs. Chen's practical consideration for the bride's needs. It was neither luxurious nor austere, but comfortable and welcoming in a way that reflected the character of the man who would now share it with her. "I'll give you some time to prepare," Samuel said, his own nervousness finally showing in the careful way he spoke. "There's no hurry for anything you're not ready for." Margaret reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work and the strength that had built everything they now shared. "Samuel, I may not know much about being a wife yet, but I know enough to recognize a good man. When I see one, we'll figure out the rest together." His kiss was answer enough, and Margaret knew that whatever storms might come to test their hastily formed union, they would face them as partners who had chosen each other with full knowledge of the challenges ahead. The scarred mail-order bride and the battle-tested rancher had found in each other exactly what they needed to build something stronger than either could create alone. 3 weeks into her marriage, Margaret discovered that being Samuel Thompson's wife involved far more complexity than she had anticipated. The morning sun was barely cresting the eastern hills when she found herself in the ranch kitchen alongside Mrs. Chen, learning to prepare breakfast for 23 hungry ranch hands, who would begin their day before the rest of the world had finished dreaming. "Biscuits must be light, never heavy," Mrs. Chen instructed, demonstrating the proper technique for cutting butter into flour. "Heavy biscuits make men think poorly of ranch. Light biscuits make them work harder, complain less." Margaret nodded, concentrating on mimicking the older woman's precise movements. Her hands, once soft from indoor work, were already showing the signs of ranch life. Small cuts from kitchen knives, burns from hot pans, calluses from helping with various tasks that required more physical strength than she'd ever needed before. "Mrs. Chen, how long did it take you to adjust to this life when you first came here?" The housekeeper paused in her work, considering the question seriously. 2 years to learn all necessary skills, 5 years to feel truly at home, 10 years to understand that home is not place you go to. Home is place you build with your own hands for people you choose to love. Margaret found comfort in the honest timeline. She'd been expecting to master everything immediately, to step seamlessly into her role as mistress of the Circle T without any awkward adjustment period. Mrs. Chen's words reminded her that building competence took time and patience. The kitchen door swung open to admit Samuel, already dressed for the day's work in worn leather chaps and a shirt that had seen many washings. His hair was still damp from washing, and he carried the scent of soap and the outdoors that Margaret was learning to associate with her husband's morning routine. "Good morning, ladies. Something smells incredible here." Mrs. Chen smiled with pride. "Mrs. Thompson is learning to make proper ranch breakfast. She has good hands for baking." Samuel moved to stand behind Margaret, his hands settling gently on her shoulders as he peered over her head at the biscuits she was shaping. The casual intimacy of the gesture still surprised her. 3 weeks ago they had been strangers, and now this man's touch felt natural and welcome. "They look perfect," he said, pressing a quick kiss to the top of her head. "The men are going to be fighting over seconds." Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the heat from the stove. Samuel's easy affection and obvious pride in her progress meant more than she could have imagined when she'd first stepped off the train in Cedar Falls. "What's the plan for today?" she asked, turning in his loose embrace to face him. "Jake and I need to ride the north pasture to check on the breeding stock. Should be back by mid-afternoon. This evening, though." Samuel's expression grew slightly cautious. "We have dinner guests. The Richardsons from the Bar R Ranch and their daughter Clarissa are coming to discuss a potential cattle deal." Margaret felt her stomach tighten at the mention of guests. She'd been dreading this moment, her first opportunity to fulfill the social obligations that came with being a prominent rancher's wife. The Richardson name was familiar from conversations she'd overheard. They owned the second-largest ranch in the county and had been among Samuel's most important business associates. "For years, the Richardsons," she repeated carefully. "Should I know anything particular about them?" Mrs. Chen made a small sound that might have been disapproval, though she continued working without looking up from her mixing bowl. Samuel's expression grew even more cautious. "Charles Richardson is a good man and a fair business partner. His wife, Eleanor, is, well, she has very definite ideas about proper society and appropriate behavior for ranch wives." Margaret understood the diplomatic phrasing. Mrs. Richardson was likely to be another version of Mrs. Worthington, a woman who would judge the new Mrs. Thompson by standards that had nothing to do with capability or character. "And their daughter? Clarissa is 22, well-educated, and has been—" Samuel paused, searching for the right words. "There were expectations in certain circles that she and I might eventually make a match." The implications hit Margaret like cold water. Clarissa Richardson wasn't just any dinner guest. She was the woman Samuel was supposed to have married, according to local social planning. Tonight's dinner would be Margaret's first face-to-face encounter with the life Samuel had rejected when he chose to marry a scarred mail-order bride instead. "I see." Margaret kept her voice steady, despite the anxiety building in her chest. "What kind of cattle deal are you discussing?" Samuel's relief at her practical response was obvious. "Joint breeding program? Richardson has some exceptional Hereford cows, and I have Thunder and 2 other quality bulls. By combining our breeding stock, we can improve both herds faster than either of us could manage independently." "Sounds like an important arrangement. I'll make sure Mrs. Chen and I prepare an appropriate dinner." "Margaret," Samuel's hands tightened slightly on her shoulders, "you don't have to prove anything to the Richardsons. You're my wife, and that's all the qualification you need for anything." His support was reassuring, but Margaret knew the evening would still be a test of her ability to hold her own in the social situations that would define much of her married life. After Samuel left for his day's work, she threw herself into preparation. With the determination of someone who refused to be found wanting, Mrs. Chen proved to be an invaluable ally in planning the dinner. She understood both the importance of making a good impression and the particular challenges Margaret would face. "Mrs. Richardson expects perfection," she warned as they planned the menu. "She finds fault with anything less than the best hotel, dining room in Denver. But she also watches to see if the new wife knows the proper way to run a ranch household." They settled on a menu that would showcase both elegance and practicality, roast beef from Circle T cattle, vegetables from Mrs. Chen's garden, fresh bread, and an apple pie that would prove Margaret's developing domestic skills. The dining room would be set with the good china Samuel had inherited from his mother, supplemented by flowers and candles to create an atmosphere of refined hospitality. As afternoon approached, Margaret took extra care with her appearance, choosing a deep blue dress that complemented her coloring while maintaining the modest neckline that concealed most of her scarring. She arranged her hair in a style that was both fashionable and practical, knowing that any perceived vanity or carelessness would be noted and criticized. The Richardsons arrived promptly at 6 o'clock, traveling in a well-appointed carriage that spoke of prosperity and social pretension. Charles Richardson proved to be a hearty man in his 50s, with greying hair and the weathered complexion of someone who spent his days outdoors despite his obvious wealth. His greeting to Margaret was warm and genuine, without any of the carefully controlled politeness she'd learned to dread. Eleanor Richardson was another matter entirely. She was a handsome woman who had clearly been beautiful in her youth, dressed in the latest Eastern fashion and carrying herself with the conscious dignity of someone accustomed to being the most important woman in any room. Her assessment of Margaret was swift and thorough, taking in every detail from hair to shoes in a single comprehensive glance. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, offering a gloved hand with the precise degree of courtesy required by etiquette and no more. "How interesting to finally meet Samuel's bride." The pause before interesting carried the same weight Margaret had learned to recognize in Mrs. Worthington's speech. Disapproval wrapped in polite language that couldn't be directly challenged without seeming oversensitive. Clarissa Richardson was undeniably lovely, with golden hair, cornflower blue eyes, and the kind of delicate features that belonged in a portrait rather than on a working ranch. She moved with practiced grace and spoke in carefully modulated tones that suggested extensive education in proper feminine accomplishments. Everything about her screamed perfect rancher's wife, according to conventional standards. "Miss Richardson," Margaret said, extending her own hand with as much warmth as she could muster. "Welcome to Circle T Ranch." "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. Your home is quite rustic, very authentic to the frontier experience, I'm sure." Another carefully delivered insult disguised as neutral observation. Margaret felt her temper stir but kept her expression pleasant. She dealt with worse criticism than anything these women could devise. Dinner proceeded with the kind of strained politeness that made every bite feel like a diplomatic negotiation. Charles Richardson and Samuel discussed business with genuine enthusiasm, their conversation ranging over cattle breeding, market conditions, and the challenges of ranch management. Eleanor Richardson made occasional comments about the meal, noting that the beef was adequately prepared and the vegetables surprisingly fresh for such a remote location. Clarissa said little during the main course, but Margaret caught her studying the dining room arrangements and table service with the critical eye of someone trained to notice social deficiencies. When Mrs. Chen served the apple pie, however, Clarissa's carefully maintained composure showed the first crack. "You made this yourself?" she asked, unable to hide her surprise at the pie's obvious quality. "Mrs. Chen has been teaching me. I'm still learning, but I enjoy the work." "How practical." The word carried a slight tone of condescension, as if practicality were somehow beneath a lady's proper concerns. Eleanor Richardson seized the opening. "Clarissa has mastered the pianoforte and speaks French fluently. She's also quite accomplished in watercolor painting and needlework. Such accomplishments are so important for a woman in society, don't you think?" The implication was clear. Margaret's domestic skills were those of a servant, while Clarissa possessed the refined abilities appropriate to a lady. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, but forced herself to respond calmly. Those are impressive accomplishments. I'm afraid my education focused more on practical matters, bookkeeping, business correspondence, household management, the skills needed to help run a boarding house. Yes, Samuel mentioned you worked in service before your marriage, Eleanor said with false sympathy. How difficult that must have been for someone of gentle breeding. The conversation continued in this vein through coffee, with Eleanor Richardson delivering a series of subtle attacks disguised as polite interest, while Clarissa maintained her air of superior accomplishment. Margaret held her ground with increasing confidence, recognizing that her critics had no real weapons beyond social snobbery and conventional expectations. When the Richardsons finally departed, Margaret felt drained but victorious. She'd survived her first major social test without losing her temper or revealing the depth of her insecurity about her new role. "That went well," Samuel said as they watched the carriage disappear into the darkness. Margaret stared at him in amazement. "Well, your former intended bride spent the entire evening demonstrating her superiority to your actual wife, and her mother treated me like an upstart servant who'd somehow tricked her way into respectability." Samuel's expression grew serious. "Is that what you thought was happening?" "What else could it have been? A business dinner where my wife conducted herself with dignity and grace while hosting people who were trying to make her feel inadequate." Samuel pulled her into his arms, his voice gentle but firm. "Margaret, you handled Eleanor Richardson's rudeness with more class than she showed all evening. Charles was impressed with your intelligence and your obvious competence in managing the household. Even Clarissa couldn't find any real fault with your hosting or your cooking." Margaret leaned into his embrace, feeling some of the evening's tension drain away. "It didn't feel like a victory, because you're judging yourself by their standards instead of recognizing that their standards are worthless." Eleanor Richardson has never had to rebuild her life from tragedy. Clarissa has never had to support herself through honest work. They've lived sheltered lives that taught them to value appearance over substance. Samuel's words helped Margaret see the evening from a different perspective. She'd been so focused on meeting the Richardsons' expectations that she'd failed to notice how poorly those expectations reflected their own character limitations. "Do you think the cattle deal will go through despite their obvious disapproval of me?" Charles Richardson cares about improving his herd, not about social gossip. "The deal will go through because it benefits both ranches." Samuel's voice carried quiet confidence. "And next time they visit, Eleanor will be polite to you, because she'll have realized that insulting my wife means losing access to profitable business arrangements." Margaret smiled at his certainty. She was beginning to understand that Samuel's support wasn't just emotional, but practical. His success and influence provided a shield against the worst effects of social disapproval. "What happens next? More dinner parties with people who think I'm beneath their notice? Some, probably, but also visits from people like Doc Mills and the Kowalskis, who judge others by their character rather than their pedigree. You'll make allies as well as critics, and eventually the balance will tip in your favor." As they prepared for bed, Margaret reflected on the evening's lessons. She'd learned that she could hold her own in hostile social situations, that Samuel's support was both genuine and effective, and that her critics' opinions mattered less than her own growing confidence in her abilities. The scarred mail order bride who'd stepped off the train a month ago would have been devastated by Eleanor Richardson's subtle cruelties. But Mrs. Samuel Thompson, partner in a thriving ranch and developing business empire, could recognize those cruelties for what they were: the desperate attempts of small-minded people to maintain their sense of superiority in a changing world. "Samuel," she said, as they settled into bed together. "Yes? Tomorrow I want to learn how to ride properly, not just sitting in buggies, but actually handling a horse myself." Samuel's smile was visible even in the dim light. "Any particular reason?" because a rancher's wife should know how to get around her own property without depending on others for transportation. And because I have a feeling I'm going to need every skill I can master for whatever comes next. Samuel's kiss was warm with approval and something deeper, pride in the woman his wife was becoming, perhaps, or recognition that their partnership was growing stronger with each challenge they faced together. Tomorrow we'll start with Belle. She's gentle enough for a beginner, but spirited enough to keep you interested. Margaret smiled into the darkness, already imagining herself riding across the vast Circle T rangeland with the confidence of someone who truly belonged there. The transformation from desperate mail-order bride to capable ranch wife was far from complete. But she was beginning to believe it was not only possible, but inevitable. The letter arrived on a crisp October morning when the aspen leaves had turned to gold and the first frost had touched the high meadows. Margaret was in the kitchen garden with Mrs. Chen, harvesting the last of the vegetables before winter settled over the ranch in earnest, when Jake Morrison approached with an expression she'd learned to recognize as trouble. "Mrs. Thompson, this came in with the mail from town. Looks official." He handed her an envelope bearing the seal of the territorial government and addressed it in the formal script of legal correspondence. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron before accepting the letter, her heart already beginning to race. Official. Correspondence usually meant problems, and she'd learned enough about ranch operations to know that problems could threaten everything Samuel had worked to build. Mrs. Chen looked up from the carrots she was pulling. "Bad news make different face than good news. That face say worry about something important." Margaret broke the seal and read quickly, her anxiety growing with each carefully worded paragraph. When she finished, she read it again to make sure. She understood the implications correctly. "What is it?" Jake asked, noting her pale complexion. "A complaint has been filed with the Territorial Land Office. Someone is challenging Samuel's ownership of the north section, the land where we graze. The breeding stock." Margaret's voice was steady despite the fear rising in her chest. "They're claiming his original homestead filing was improperly recorded and that the land should revert to public domain for new claims." Jake's weathered face darkened. "That's 1,500 acres of our best grazing land. Without it, we'd have to reduce the herd by nearly a third." Margaret understood the devastating mathematics. Smaller herd meant less income, which meant difficulty meeting their financial obligations, which could eventually mean losing the entire ranch. Someone was attempting to destroy Samuel's business through legal manipulation. "Who filed the complaint?" "Margaret." Checked the signature at the bottom of the letter, though she already suspected what she would find. "Hamilton P. Worthington, Esquire, representing interested parties seeking to develop agricultural opportunities in the region." Mrs. Chen made a sound of disgust. "Mrs. Worthington, husband? Lawyer man who think law is weapon for hurting good people." Jake spat into the dirt. "Worthington's been sniffing around other ranchers' property claims too. Heard he's been offering to resolve questionable filings for substantial fees. It's legal extortion, but proving that would be nearly impossible." Margaret felt cold anger, beginning to replace her initial fear. Hamilton Worthington wasn't just threatening Samuel's livelihood, he was attacking their entire future, including the plans for the valley development that could transform the region's economy. When does Samuel need to respond to this? Hearing is scheduled for next month in Helena. Says here he needs to provide original documentation proving his claim was filed correctly, along with witness testimony about his continuous occupation and improvement of the land. Margaret's mind was already working through the implications. Helena was 3 days hard travel from the ranch, and November weather could make the journey treacherous. More importantly, Samuel would need to present a flawless legal case against an experienced attorney who had chosen his moment carefully. "We need to get word to Samuel immediately." "Where is he today?" "Rode out early to check the south fence line." With two of the hands. Won't be back until evening. Margaret made a quick decision. Jake, can you send someone to find him and bring him home? This can't wait until tonight. I'll go myself. Take me about 3 hours to reach him and 3 more to get back. Jake was already turning toward the barn. Mrs. Thompson, don't let this spook you too bad. Samuel's been dealing with legal challenges since he started this. Place. He knows how to fight. After Jake departed, Margaret found herself pacing the kitchen while Mrs. Chen continued her meal preparations with the steady calm that seemed unshakable. The older woman's composure helped Margaret organize her own thoughts and consider what needed to be done. Mrs. Chen, how much do you know about Samuel's original homestead claim? Know he file everything proper. Keep all papers in a strongbox. In study, always be very careful about legal requirements. Mrs. Chen paused in her chopping. But papers are only good if people who check them are honest. Lawyers like Mr. Worthington know how to make honest papers look dishonest. Margaret had suspected as much. This wasn't really about improper filing. It was about creating enough legal confusion to force Samuel into an expensive court battle that would drain his resources regardless of the outcome. She spent the afternoon in Samuel's study, familiarizing herself with his filing system and locating all the documents related to the North Section land claim. The paperwork appeared meticulously maintained, with every required form properly completed and witnessed. But Margaret had learned enough about territorial politics to know that proper paperwork didn't guarantee protection against determined legal assault. Samuel arrived home just as the sun was setting behind the western peaks, his face grim with the news Jake had already delivered. Margaret met him at the door with the official letter and all the related documents spread out for his review. "How bad is it?" she asked without preamble. Samuel read through the complaint carefully, his expression growing darker with each paragraph. "Worse than I expected. Worthington isn't just challenging the filing. He's claiming I never met the residency requirements because I traveled to Texas twice during the first year to settle family business." "Did you meet the requirements?" "Technically, yes. I was never absent for more than 30 days at a time, and I had Jake maintaining the property in my absence. But proving that 8 years later, with witnesses who may have moved away or died," Samuel set the papers down heavily. "It'll be difficult." Margaret studied her husband's face, reading the worry he was trying to hide. "What does Worthington really want? This seems like an expensive way to harass you if his only goal is legal fees. The North Section contains the best water rights on the ranch. Without it, the entire operation becomes vulnerable to drought years. More importantly, it controls access to the mountain passes that would be crucial for the railroad spur line we're planning." The full scope of the attack became clear to Margaret. This wasn't just about destroying Samuel's current business. It was about preventing his future development plans that could transform the entire region's economy. "Someone told Worthington about the railroad plans," Samuel nodded grimly. "Had to be someone with inside knowledge of both our business arrangements and the territorial development planning. The timing is too perfect to be coincidental." Margaret felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. The Richardson dinner. Eleanor and Clarissa were asking very specific questions about your land holdings and future plans. I thought they were just being nosy. Charles wouldn't betray business confidences, but his wife. Samuel ran his hands through his hair in frustration. "Eleanor Richardson and Helena Worthington have been friends for 20 years. If Eleanor repeated our conversation to Helena and Helena shared it with her husband, the betrayal stung more than Margaret had expected. She'd survived Eleanor Richardson's social cruelties, but discovering that her dinner party conversation had been used to attack her husband's livelihood felt like a more personal violation. What do we do now? Fight. Travel to Helena. Present. Our case and hope the territorial officials are more interested in justice than in whatever Worthington is offering them under the table. Margaret heard determination in Samuel's voice, but also exhaustion. He'd been building this ranch for 8 years, pouring every ounce of energy and resources into creating something lasting. Now he faced the possibility of losing a crucial piece of it to legal manipulation by people who'd contributed nothing to the region's development. "I'm coming with you to Helena." Samuel looked up sharply. "Margaret, it's going to be a hard journey in uncertain weather, and the hearing itself will be unpleasant. Worthington will attack every aspect of our lives, including our marriage, if he thinks it will help his case. All the more reason I should be there. We're partners in this, Samuel. That means facing the difficult battles together, not leaving you to fight alone." The relief in Samuel's expression told Margaret she'd made the right decision. "It won't be easy. Worthington will probably try to paint you as evidence of my instability or poor judgment. Let him try. I've survived worse criticism than anything he can devise." Margaret moved to stand behind Samuel's chair, her hands settling on his shoulders in a gesture that had become natural over their months of marriage. "Besides, I have some experience with territorial legal procedures from helping my father deal with licensing requirements for the boarding house." Samuel reached up to cover her hands with his own. "What kind of experience?" "The kind that taught me how to research precedent cases, organize evidence, and prepare witness testimony. I may not be a lawyer, but I understand how to build a compelling legal argument." For the first time since Jake had delivered the letter, Samuel smiled. "Mrs. Thompson, you continue to surprise me." "Good. A predictable wife would be boring." Margaret squeezed his shoulders affectionately. "Now, let's figure out exactly what evidence we need to gather and which witnesses we can convince to make the journey to Helena." They spent the evening developing their legal strategy, with Margaret taking notes while Samuel outlined the key points they needed to prove. Her organizational skills, developed through years of managing a complex boarding house operation, proved invaluable in creating a systematic approach to their defense. "We need to prove continuous residence, which means documenting my presence on the land throughout the required period," Samuel explained. "We also need to show substantial improvements, the buildings, fencing, water systems, everything that demonstrates genuine settlement rather than speculative claim jumping." "What about the temporary absences Worthington is challenging?" "We need witnesses who can testify that Jake was maintaining the property as my authorized agent, and documentation showing the family business in Texas was legitimate rather than just an excuse to abandon the homestead." Margaret made detailed notes, already thinking about how to organize their evidence for maximum impact. "The territorial office will have records of your original filing. Can we get copies to compare with whatever Worthington is claiming?" "Good thinking. If there are discrepancies between our records and theirs, it might prove someone has been tampering with the official files." As they worked late into the night, Margaret felt her understanding of their situation deepening. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a test of everything they'd built together, both as business partners and as husband and wife. Success would secure their future and vindicate Samuel's years of hard work. Failure could cost them everything. "Samuel, there's something else we need to consider. If we win this case, Worthington and his allies won't just give up. Victory might make us bigger targets for future attacks." Samuel nodded soberly. "I've thought about that, but running from bullies only encourages them to pick new targets. Sometimes you have to make a stand, regardless of the personal cost." Margaret understood the principle, but she also recognized the practical reality of their situation. They were fighting people with substantial resources and political connections, people who could afford to lose individual battles as long as they eventually won the war. Then we'd better make sure this victory is decisive enough to discourage future challenges. Samuel's smile held genuine admiration. "How do you propose we do that?" Margaret had been thinking about this question since. She'd first read Worthington's complaint, by turning their attack into an opportunity to expose the entire scheme. If Worthington is challenging multiple ranchers' claims, there's probably a pattern of corruption we can document. Instead of just defending our land, we go on the offensive and reveal his methods to the territorial authorities. The strategy was risky, but it offered the possibility of not just surviving Worthington's attack, but destroying his ability to threaten other honest settlers. Samuel's expression showed he understood both the potential and the danger. That would require convincing other targeted ranchers to cooperate with our investigation and gathering evidence that Worthington has been careful to hide. "I have an idea about that too." Mrs. Chen mentioned that her husband worked on the railroad and knows people throughout the territory. Railroad workers see everything and remember everything. They might know about other cases where Worthington has used similar tactics. Samuel leaned back in his chair, studying his wife with growing respect. "You're talking about building a case that could expose territorial-level corruption. That's not just risky, it's potentially dangerous." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "Everything worthwhile involves risk. You risked everything to build this ranch. I risked everything to marry you. Now we're risking everything to protect what we've built together." The simple truth of her words settled between them like a benediction. They were no longer the desperate mail-order bride and the lonely rancher who'd found each other through newspaper advertisements. They were partners who'd chosen to face their challenges together, whatever the cost. "Then we'd better start gathering evidence," Samuel said, reaching for his hat. "This is going to be the fight of our lives." Margaret smiled, feeling the familiar surge of determination that had carried her through every major challenge since the fire that had changed everything. "Good. I was getting tired of easy victories." As they prepared for bed, both of them understood that their marriage was about to face its greatest test. Success in Helena would prove they could overcome any obstacle as partners. Failure would cost them not just the ranch, but the future they'd been building together. But Margaret felt no doubt about the outcome. She'd survived losing everything once before, and she'd learned that people who underestimated scarred women usually discovered their mistake too late to avoid the consequences. The territorial courthouse in Helena was imposing in the way that government buildings were designed to be: massive stone walls, tall windows, and an atmosphere that made ordinary citizens feel small and insignificant. Margaret stood beside Samuel on the courthouse steps, her leather satchel containing 3 weeks' worth of evidence gathering, witness statements, and legal research that represented their last hope of saving the Circle T Ranch. The November air carried the bite of winter, and snow had begun falling during their final day of travel, adding urgency to proceedings that were already fraught with consequence. Inside that building, Hamilton Worthington was preparing to present his case for stripping away Samuel's land rights. But Margaret had spent every day since receiving his challenge preparing for this moment, and she was no longer the uncertain woman who'd stepped off the train in Cedar Falls 6 months ago. "Ready?" Samuel asked, adjusting his formal coat, the same one he'd worn to their wedding, now pressed into service for this far more consequential occasion. "More than ready," Margaret replied, surprising herself with the confidence in her voice. They entered the courthouse together, their footsteps echoing in the marble-floored corridor. The hearing room was smaller than Margaret had expected, with wooden benches for observers and a raised desk where Territorial Commissioner James Mitchell would preside over the proceedings. Hamilton Worthington was already present, a thin man, with sharp features and the kind of expensive clothing that announced his success in exploiting legal technicalities for profit. Commissioner Mitchell appeared to be in his 60s, with graying hair and the weathered complexion of someone who'd spent years in territorial government. His reputation for fairness was legendary, but Margaret knew that even honest officials could be swayed by skilled legal manipulation when presented with confusing evidence. "Mr. Thompson, Mr. Worthington," Commissioner Mitchell said as they took their places at opposite tables. "This hearing concerns the validity of Homestead Claim Number 847A, filed in 1879 for the north section of what is now known as the Circle T Ranch. Mr. Worthington, as the challenging party, you will present your case first." Worthington rose with the theatrical confidence of someone accustomed to dominating legal proceedings. "Commissioner Mitchell, the evidence will show that Mr. Thompson's original homestead filing was fundamentally flawed and that his subsequent claim to this valuable land is therefore invalid." For the next hour, Worthington methodically presented his case. He produced documents purporting to show discrepancies in Samuel's original filing, witness statements claiming Samuel had been absent from the property for extended periods, and technical arguments about proper boundary surveys that would have confused a team of professional surveyors. Margaret watched Commissioner Mitchell's face carefully, looking for signs of how the arguments were being received. The official appeared genuinely troubled by some of Worthington's evidence, particularly documents that seemed to contradict Samuel's version of events. When Worthington finished, Commissioner Mitchell turned to Samuel. "Mr. Thompson, how do you respond to these allegations?" Samuel rose, but instead of speaking immediately, he looked at Margaret. In that glance, she saw complete trust in her judgment and her preparation. She nodded slightly, giving him the confidence to proceed with the strategy they'd developed together. "Commissioner Mitchell, my wife has prepared our response to Mr. Worthington's allegations. With your permission, I'd like her to present our case." A murmur ran through the courtroom observers. It was highly unusual for a woman to speak in territorial legal proceedings, especially in defense of property rights that were traditionally considered male concerns. Worthington's expression showed surprise and disapproval at this breach of conventional practice. Commissioner Mitchell studied Margaret with curious interest. "Mrs. Thompson, are you prepared to speak on your husband's behalf in this matter?" "I am, Commissioner, and I believe our evidence will show that Mr. Worthington's challenge is based on deliberate misrepresentation and document manipulation." Margaret rose and moved to the center of the room, her satchel in hand and her notes organized with the precision that had made her father's boarding house one of the most efficiently run establishments in Columbus. She'd learned during the past weeks that legal proceedings were essentially elaborate storytelling contests, where the most convincing narrative usually prevailed. "Commissioner Mitchell, Mr. Worthington would have you believe that my husband was a careless settler who failed to meet homestead requirements through ignorance or deliberate fraud. The evidence tells a different story entirely." She opened her satchel and began laying out documents on the table with practiced efficiency. "These are certified copies of the original homestead filing, obtained directly from the Territorial Land Office. As you can see, every requirement was met precisely and completely." Commissioner Mitchell examined the documents, comparing them to the versions Worthington had presented. "There appear to be significant differences between these filings and the ones submitted by Mr. Worthington." "Exactly, which raises the question of how such discrepancies occurred." Margaret produced another set of papers. "These are affidavits from 3 current and former Territorial Land Office employees, all stating that certain files have been accessed and potentially altered by unauthorized persons over the past several months." Worthington shot to his feet. "Commissioner, I object to these unsubstantiated allegations of impropriety. Mr. Worthington, you'll have your opportunity to respond." Commissioner Mitchell's voice carried warning. "Please continue, Mrs. Thompson." Margaret proceeded methodically through their evidence, presenting witness statements that proved Samuel's continuous residence, documentation of substantial property improvements, and records showing that his temporary absences had been properly authorized and maintained by designated agents. But the most devastating evidence came next. Commissioner Mitchell, during our investigation, we discovered that Mr. Worthington has filed similar challenges against 7 other ranches throughout the territory, all following identical patterns, and targeting properties with valuable water rights or strategic locations. She produced a thick folder of documents. These are copies of complaints, correspondence, and settlement agreements showing a systematic pattern of legal extortion. Mr. Worthington identifies properties with minor filing irregularities. Files challenges that would be expensive to defend, then offers to resolve the disputes for substantial payments that transfer portions of the challenged land to entities he controls. The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs. Commissioner Mitchell pounded his gavel for order while Worthington's face flushed with anger and alarm. Furthermore, Margaret continued, we have testimony from railroad surveyor Michael O'Brien, who states that Mr. Worthington approached him last month seeking detailed information about planned railroad routes and their impact on property values. Mr. O'Brien's statement indicates that Mr. Worthington's interest in my husband's land is connected to inside knowledge of future development plans. She handed the surveyor's affidavit to Commissioner Mitchell, whose expression grew increasingly grim as he read. Commissioner, Worthington interjected desperately, these accusations are irrelevant to the specific question of Mr. Thompson's homestead compliance. On the contrary, Margaret said firmly, they establish motive for deliberate document manipulation and fraudulent legal challenges, but if Commissioner Mitchell prefers to focus solely on the homestead requirements, we can certainly do that. She produced her final piece of evidence, a leather-bound ledger that she opened to a page marked with ribbon. This is the daily log maintained by Jake Morrison during my husband's absences from the property. Every day of occupation is documented, along with detailed records of property maintenance, livestock care, and improvement activities. Commissioner Mitchell examined the ledger carefully, noting the consistent entries and authentic wear that proved its contemporaneous creation. This appears to document continuous occupation and development throughout the required period. It does. And we have 3 additional witnesses present today who can testify to the accuracy of these records and my husband's compliance with all homestead requirements. Margaret called Jake Morrison, Dr. Mills, and surprisingly, Charles Richardson, to testify. Each man confirmed different aspects of Samuel's homestead compliance, with Richardson's testimony particularly damaging to Worthington's case, since his business relationship with Samuel provided detailed knowledge of property development and occupancy patterns. When Richardson finished his testimony, Commissioner Mitchell looked directly at Worthington. Mr. Worthington, do you have evidence to refute these witness statements and documentation? Worthington rose slowly, clearly struggling to salvage his position. Commissioner, irregularities in the original filing remain regardless of subsequent compliance. What irregularities? Margaret interjected. You've presented documents that contradict the certified territorial records, but you've provided no explanation for how such discrepancies occurred. Are you claiming the Territorial Land Office has been maintaining false records for 8 years? The trap was perfectly set. Worthington could either admit his documents were falsified or accuse the territorial government of systematic record-keeping fraud. Either choice would destroy his credibility. Commissioner Mitchell didn't wait for Worthington's response. Mrs. Thompson, you mentioned evidence of broader misconduct. Are you prepared to present formal charges against Mr. Worthington for investigation by territorial authorities? Margaret had hoped for this opportunity. We are, Commissioner, and we have additional evidence that suggests this pattern of fraudulent challenges extends beyond individual property disputes to systematic corruption. involving territorial land records. She produced letters that Mrs. Chen's husband had helped them obtain from railroad workers, territorial employees, and other ranchers, all documenting Worthington's systematic exploitation of legal technicalities for personal profit. The hearing had transformed from a simple property dispute into an exposure of territorial-level corruption that would require investigation by higher authorities. Commissioner Mitchell's expression showed he understood the broader implications. "Mr. Worthington, in light of the evidence presented today, I'm not only denying your challenge to Mr. Thompson's homestead claim, but referring this entire matter to the Territorial Attorney General for criminal investigation." Margaret felt relief flood through her, but she wasn't finished yet. "Commissioner Mitchell, there's one more matter. The stress and expense of defending against this fraudulent challenge has cost my husband substantial time and resources during a critical period in ranch operations. We request that Mr. Worthington be ordered to compensate us for our legal expenses and lost income." Commissioner Mitchell nodded approvingly. "Granted. Mr. Worthington, you'll provide full compensation for the Thompsons' expenses within 30 days, and you're hereby prohibited from filing any further challenges against property claims in this territory pending the outcome of the criminal investigation." The gavel's final bang echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, ending not just their legal challenge, but Worthington's career as a legal predator. Margaret packed her papers with steady hands, amazed at how calm she felt after weeks of preparation. For this moment, outside the courthouse, Samuel pulled her into his arms, despite the public setting and the falling snow. "Margaret, that was extraordinary. You didn't just win our case. You ended Worthington's ability to threaten other honest settlers." "We ended it," she corrected. "I couldn't have gathered that evidence without your knowledge of the ranching community and your reputation opening doors for investigation." As they walked toward their hotel, Margaret reflected on how much had changed since that morning 6 months ago when she'd stepped off the train in Cedar Falls. The scared, scarred woman seeking refuge had become a confident partner in an enterprise that was helping shape Montana Territory's future. "What happens now?" she asked as they reached their room. Samuel's smile held promise and certainty. "Now we go home and start planning the next phase of development, the railroad spur line, the new town, everything we've been working toward." "And personally?" Samuel's expression grew tender as he cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently tracing the faded scars that had once made her feel unworthy of love. "Personally, I think it's time we started working on that next generation I mentioned wanting to pass our legacy to." Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the hotel room's fireplace. Mrs. Thompson, partner in a cattle ranch and town development scheme, mother to future generations of Montana settlers, she mused. "It has a nice ring to it. Better than mail-order bride?" Margaret laughed, remembering the desperate woman who'd answered a stranger's advertisement for a wife. "Much better. Though I have to admit that mail-order bride showed remarkable judgment in choosing her destination." Samuel's kiss was her answer, and in it Margaret tasted the future they were building together, vast as the Montana sky, solid as the mountains that surrounded their home, and strong enough to weather whatever storms might come. The scarred woman and the battle-tested rancher had found in each other exactly what they'd needed to build something greater than either could have achieved alone. Their story would become part of Montana legend, not as tragedy overcome, but as the beginning of a dynasty that would shape the territory for generations to come. As snow continued to fall outside their window, Margaret Thompson, formerly a desperate mail-order bride, now partner in an empire, fell asleep in her husband's arms, dreaming of the children who would inherit the legacy they were building together. A legacy that proved sometimes the most unlikely matches create the strongest foundations for extraordinary futures. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.